Hey y'all! It's entry number 51 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on A.J. Brown, wide receiver, Philadelphia Eagles. We'll start with the positives with A.J. Brown's fantasy profile. Insane per route efficiency. A.J. Brown has been one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL since entering the league in 2019. He's the only wide receiver in the NFL who's finished with at least 2.65 yards per route run in each of the last 3 seasons, with 3.46 yards per route run in 2019, 2.76 yards per route run in 2020, and 2.72 yards per route run in 2021 according to Player Profiler. He's been just as efficient from a fantasy perspective as well. In 2019, A.J. Brown averaged 0.71 fantasy points per pass route, the second best among wide receivers. In 2020, A.J. Brown averaged 0.62 fantasy points per route run, which ranks second among wide receivers. And in 2021, he averaged 0.57 fantasy points per route run, which ranked as the 7th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. By being so efficient every time he runs a route, it makes it easier to trust A.J. Brown to put up solid fantasy numbers, even if he's not getting peppered with targets to the same level as other wideouts. The next thing I really like about A.J. Brown's fantasy profile is that he's possibly healthier than the past couple of seasons. A.J. Brown has played through injuries the past couple of seasons, which has impacted his effectiveness at times. During the 2020 season, A.J. Brown played a majority of the season through 2 knee injuries, where he got hurt in week 2 that required surgery after the year was over. During the 2021 season, he had multiple injuries that included a knee injury in the preseason, a hamstring injury, and a chest injury according to Draft Sharks. As of right now, A.J. Brown appears to be the healthiest he's been since his rookie year, which means that he could be in line for the best year of his career. The last thing I really like about A.J. Brown's fantasy profile is his air yards. During the 2021 season, A.J. Brown averaged 2.08 air yards per snap, 92.3 air yards per game, and had 32% of his team's air yards according to RotoWire. These numbers were all on the upper end of the spectrum for a wide receiver and show what kind of potential A.J. Brown has. Moving on to some of the concerns with A.J. Brown's fantasy profile. To start, we have to talk about his quarterback play. Jalen Hurts was fine as a fantasy asset last year, but that was primarily because of his rushing upside. As a passer, during the 2021 season, Hurts completed just 265 passes on 432 passing attempts for 3,144 passing yards and 16 passing touchdowns in 15 games. On a per-game basis, this was just 17.7 completions on 28.8 passing attempts for 209.6 passing yards and 1.07 passing touchdowns per game. These per-game numbers are lower than Ryan Tannehill's, A.J. Brown's quarterback in 2021. So, if Hurts doesn't take a step forward as a passer in 2022, A.J. Brown's upside may be more limited relative to other elite fantasy wide receivers. The next concern I have with A.J. Brown's fantasy profile is his previous targets and competing for targets with Devonta Smith. Despite being one of the premier receivers in the NFL, A.J. Brown's season target totals each year haven't been very impressive relative to other top wideouts, with 84 targets in 2019, 106 targets in 2020, and 105 targets in 2021 according to Pro Football Reference. Devonta Smith is also likely to be the most talented pass-catching teammate that A.J. Brown has played with, mainly because Julio Jones was a shell of himself last year in Tennessee. Because of this, there's a bit of a question mark on how Smith could impact Brown's target share in 2022. The last concern I have with A.J. Brown's fantasy profile is the Eagles' 2021 run-heavy offense. A.J. Brown got traded to pretty much the only team in the league that runs the ball as much as the Tennessee Titans. in the Philadelphia Eagles. By playing in another run-heavy offense, it may limit the weekly workload for A.J. Brown. Some additional thoughts on A.J. Brown. During the 2021 season, A.J. Brown finished as the WR32 in Standard, with 117.9 total fantasy points and 9.1 fantasy points per game. The WR32 in half PPR formats, with 149.4 total fantasy points and 11.5 fantasy points per game, and the WR32 in full PPR formats, with 180.9 total fantasy points and 13.9 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, A.J. Brown had 2 out of 13 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 13 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 13 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 0 out of 13 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 13 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 13 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season, A.J. Brown finished as the WR9 in Standard, with 177.5 total fantasy points, the WR11 in half PPR, with 212.5 total fantasy points, and the WR12 in full PPR formats in terms of total fantasy points, with 247.5 total fantasy points according to Fantasy Pros. In fantasy points per game, he was the WR4 in Standard with 12.7 fantasy points per game, the WR5 in half PPR formats with 15.2 fantasy points per game, and the WR6 in full PPR formats with 17.7 fantasy points per game. In half PPR formats during the 2020 season, A.J. Brown had 1 out of 14 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 14 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 14 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 14 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 3 out of 14 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 14 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni has been below average in featuring his wide receivers over the course of his career in an offensive coordinator or head coaching role. Personal opinion: A.J. Brown is currently going off the board as WR12 about pick 35 overall on ESPN and WR12 about pick 33 overall on Yahoo. Going into this entry, I was thinking Brown might be a little overvalued based on his team's offense, but after doing the research, I actually think he might be a little undervalued here. Going into the 2022 season, I have him in the WR9 to WR12 range depending on the scoring format. I totally get the concerns with Hurts as his starting quarterback and the run-heavy offense in general, but it wasn't like Ryan Tannehill completely lit the world on fire the past few years from a per-game totals perspective, and the Titans have been as run-heavy as the Eagles. The bottom line is that Brown is one of the most efficient wide receivers in the league, who has already been a top 5 fantasy wide receiver on a per-game basis in the past, in standard and half PPR formats in 2020, even in a run-heavy offense, and he should be healthier in 2022. For each of these entries, we highlight a charitable cause or organization that the player is passionate about. A.J. Brown's My Cause My Cleats in 2020 was for the Sentencing Project. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.